Well, good evening. I'm Chris Brown, the Deputy Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's GE Aviation Lecture. Since 1982, this lecture series has spotlighted more than 140 of the biggest names in modern aviation history. Like all of our public programs, this lecture is presented free of charge. This is possible thanks through the generous support from GE Aviation. Private contributions like theirs are critical to our programs and exhibitions, and it is my privilege to acknowledge them for their long-standing and valued support. Representing GE Aviation with us tonight is Lisa Cora-Bockley, Digital Solutions Leader of Military Systems Operations at GE Aviation. Lisa, to you and your colleagues at GE, we thank you for your substantial and enduring support. Since we opened the museum here on the Mall in 1976 and the Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly in 2003, more than 350 million people have walked through our doors to be informed and inspired by the history of flight and space travel. Drawing from the museum's priceless collection of iconic artifacts and intellectual trust, our curators, educators, docents, volunteers, and others endeavor to tell stories about aerospace and how it has defined and shaped the American experience. This evening, we are joined by a father-daughter team who, by virtue of their professional roles on September 11th, 2001, offer us a unique glimpse into the horrors and tragedy of that fateful day. Not every aviation story is an uplifting or happy one. Indeed, for those of us professionally committed to the furtherance of aerospace, the horrific use of commercial jet airliners as weapons of terror was particularly disturbing. And yet, we endured as a community. And in the years since 9/11, the aviation industry has become more safe, more accessible, more affordable, more proficient, and even more influential than ever before. 9/11, for all its pain and tragedy, is indeed a story to be told and remembered. To help do that, I would like to introduce Heather Lucky Penney. Most widely recognized for her service on September 11th, Heather Penney was part of the first wave of women who went directly into fighters from pilot training. She grew up around aviation and warbirds and applied to the Air National Guard to fly F-16s as soon as she learned that Congress had opened combat aviation to women. The first and only woman in the 121st Fighter Squadron, Heather deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom for initial combat operations in nighttime scud hunting in the western deserts of Iraq, and also supported special operations teams. Heather flew the F-16 for 10 years before joining Lockheed Martin as the Director of Air Force Aviation Training Systems, specializing in government relations and strategic business development. Heather's passion for aviation has never faded. She has raced jets at Reno Air Races. She has over 3,000 hours with commercial instructor, multi-engine, and air transport pilot ratings, and volunteers with the Collings Foundation, co-piloting their B-17 when her busy schedule permits. She enjoys flying her own Stearman, a 1950 Cessna 170, along with her family and rescue dog, fittingly named Gilmore after Roscoe Turner's lion. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Heather Lucky Penney.
So thank you all for coming out here tonight. And again, Lisa, I really thank you so much, and to the generosity of GE to support this lecture series. What the museum, what the Air and Space Museum does, and what the GE Aviation Lecture Series allows the museum to do is to tell these stories, like mine, so that people like yourselves can experience aviation, can experience history in a far more personal and hopefully impactful manner than when you just simply see the signs next to the airplane. So again, thank you, Lisa, for everything that you and GE are doing to support this lecture series, to make it possible so that, for example, people like me can come listen to my heroes when they come and stand up on this podium. Now, I'm certainly not calling myself a hero at all, because 9/11 was nothing that any of us planned. And as you all know, because you all have your stories and your experiences of 9/11, every single one of us, every single American, was somehow touched by that day. We all have our connections. We all somehow lost either people, loved ones. So I appreciate the fact that you all are here today to listen to my 9/11 story. Because really, all I did that day was show up for work, right? We had just gotten back from 2 weeks at Red Flag, which was, at that point in my time as a young baby fighter pilot, the pinnacle of what I could ever hope for and experience. I had killed 2 MiGs, I had dropped bombs, I had been there for my time on target. And we had just gotten back from that prior weekend. We landed on Saturday. So most people had taken that Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday off to reconnect with their families. I was single at the time, and so I went home on Sunday, did my laundry, and was ready to go to work. So that Tuesday, we're going through just the normal administration of running a fighter squadron, right? What jets do we have? What sorties are we going to be flying? We were traditional mostly at the time. We're a guard unit, so a guard is comprised of a few full-time staff that make sure that the unit runs and all the administration and is taken care of, so that when the part-timers show up, that they can just jump in the jets and go and train. I was one of those few full-time staff. Who needs check rides? Who's doing upgrades? We had just gotten back from Red Flag, so that the jets were fitted out with TERS and external fuel tanks and ECM pods, and we had our training missiles on board. And we were moving into a training phase of dogfighting, basic fighter maneuvering. We called it BFM. It's just a lot of basic fun, if you ask me. But the maintainers, it was going to take them a while to pull the external fuel tanks and the TERS. It was going to take them a while to reconfigure the jets to go do, to clean them up. So we had slick Vipers, so we could just go G our noses off, So we had 3 guys that we could send down into the Air Force Dare County ranges down in North Carolina. We call it bully flight. It was Lou Shooter Campbell was bully 1. Eric Puck Hagenson was bully 2. And then we had Billy Hutchison was bully 3. So they brief, they take off. They're headed down to North Carolina to go bomb for quarters and strafe, because who doesn't like a little bit of low-angle strafe? Everyone loves shooting the gun. And by the way, I've never seen a fighter pilot ever pull the gun and not go, brrr. We all make the noise. So they're down, they're bombing. We're sitting in an administrative meeting, and we get this knock at the door. And an enlisted guy pokes his noggin in. It was David Callahan, Chunks is what we called him. And Dave says, an airplane just flew into the World Trade Center. And we looked outside because our conference room was right on the flight line. It was a huge plate glass window. And we're thinking, how does that happen? Because as you know, New York actually isn't that far away, contrary to what traffic would have you believe. It's actually really just kind of a stone's throw as far as the bird flies. And we share very similar weather patterns. We look outside, and it's that perfect crystal autumn day that we get here. What? So we're thinking, did someone pooch their approach into LaGuardia? It must have just been one of those little sightseeing airplanes going down the Hudson. It just kind of made a wrong turn. Maybe it was scud running. And we made a couple of jokes about little airplanes bouncing off of buildings. And then, because they certainly don't do any damage. They just sort of fall to the ground. The airplanes, that is. And continued on. It wasn't, it wasn't really anything that triggered us. Until a few minutes later, Chunks knocks at the door again and says, another airplane flew into the other World Trade Center. It was on purpose. We got up from our chairs and walked to the bar where we had the television, and we saw what everyone else in America saw that day. We saw the footage of these airliners crashing into the trade centers. And we were absolutely stunned. So people have asked, how could this have been possible, right? I mean, didn't we have aircraft on alert? Well, once upon a time, we sat alert, but that was before we got our F-16s. I mean, we gave up alert when we had shifted from, the thuds to the F-4s, and so it had been a long time since we had sat alert. Because if you recall, in 1991, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell, we didn't need it anymore, right? The Soviet bear threat was gone, and so we pared down our entire military through the peace dividend, and on September 10th and on September 11th, there were really only 4 units sitting alert, looking out over the oceans and over the polar region to ensure that no stray bombers came over the North Pole to nuke us. I mean, that was the paradigm that we were living in. So no one ever imagined that the threat would come from inside. We just had never conceived that something so ingenious in the most horrible way could be done. So nearly immediately, Mark Sasseville, who was our DO at the time, he goes to the operations desk. Dan Kane, who was our weapons officer, turns to me and goes, Lucky, I need you and Igor to build up some DTCs. Get us some maps, get us some takeoff and landing data. I don't know what it needs to look like, but just make it happen. So Brandon Rasmussen, Igor, and I go to the flight mission planning room, and we start mission planning for something. We don't know what. Again, I mean, this is not the defensive counter-air mission that I had trained for, that I knew how to do. I mean, there was a certain point where you had a combat air patrol, and I've got a point that I'm defending. But defending against who? We don't have AWACS, we don't have, we just have our own little bitty radars. And we don't know who's hostile, who's friendly. And nothing is clear. Everything is as confused as you could have imagined it. But we do our best. We print out our lineup cards with our takeoff and landing data. We get 2 sets because some of the jets are clean and some of the jets are still heavy and dirty in the air-to-ground configuration. We print out maps of the entire local area. We put steer points on top of where we know government buildings are, where memorials are. We load up our data transfer cartridges, our DTCs. They're like these big bricks that are really kind of like thumb drives for your jet, where you can take all of your data and then put it into the jet and download it so that you can accelerate and program all of your avionics. We get that done, and Igor and I go to Hawk, the ops desk. Now, I'll need to go through a little bit of bureaucracy because the National Guard in DC is not like the National Guard in any other state. In other states, the National Guard has 2 chains of command. You've got your federal chain of command, which only occurs when you get activated to deploy. And in that case, you're chopped to the active duty Air Force, and you're, for all intents and purposes, active duty Air Force. And then that's your federal chain of command. The civilian chain of command goes up to the state's governor. And we're seeing that now, where we have Texas and Florida and Montana and Washington and Oregon activating elements of their National Guard to serve their domestic requirement to protect their people in their state. And so there's a very clear chain of command that goes up to the governor. Well, DC doesn't have a governor, and our chain of command did not go to the mayor. Our chain of command on the civilian side went to the President of the United States. If you can imagine, he was pretty busy at that point in time. And honestly, I don't think he even realized that we were a resource that he had, because his authority was traditionally delegated down through the Secretary to the Secretary of the Army. And that's certainly not what the Secretary of the Army was thinking about, is how do I get some defensive counter air up over DC? That was not on his mind. So we're trying to get activated so that we're trying to get the chain of command energized. We're trying to find someone who has the legal authority to tell us to launch. How do we get airborne? Because we can't just take off on our own. There's a very real and important reason why the civilians have the command of our military. So as much as we know we need to be airborne, we can't, so we're grounded. Our general officer, our wing commander, David Worley, had come down from the wing building, and he's sitting by the ops desk, and he's making phone calls. He's trying to find someone to energize through his, he's our top guy. He's making as many phone calls as he can. Dan Kane, our weapons officer, takes a risk and calls down to the bomb dump. Now, the bomb dump is where we keep all of our explosives. It's where we keep all of our training missiles. It's where we keep all of our bullets. It's where we keep all of our bombs. We do have some live bombs. We do have some live missiles, but we don't fly with them every day. You certainly wouldn't want live bombs and live missiles flying over your house on a daily basis if we have no intention of dropping them or using them. And that wouldn't make any sense to us either, because it would just simply wear out those systems. And oh, by the way, we don't keep the explosives and the fuses and the bodies, whether or not it's a missile body or a bomb body, all built up, ready to go. You have it all separated. You have to build it. It takes time. For example, when we go to war, it's a 3-day cycle from the planning process to come down to the wing for the bomb dump to know exactly how many bombs they need to build, to actually put all that together, to bring it out on the flight line, to configure the aircraft. It doesn't happen instantaneously. So Raisin calls down to the bomb dump and tells them to build us up some AIM-9s, some heat-seeking Sidewinders. Can you imagine if you're one of the enlisted airmen down in the bomb dump? You're not watching television. You're probably in the middle of a card game. And you get a phone call from the weapons officer, and he's telling you, build me up some missiles. No, live ones. Just trust me. Can you imagine what would be going through your mind? You have no air tasking order. You've got no legal paperwork, no paper trail to prove that this is a legal order for you to execute. So it really is a testament to the vision, the leadership, and the courage that Raisin must have had to make that phone call, because we desperately needed those missiles, even though, in my case, it wouldn't be in time. Being DC, again, something unique to operating out of Andrews is we always had to deal with the hassle of Air Force One. Anytime a distinguished visitor moves on Andrews Air Force Base, and especially when it's the president, the entire base shuts down. I mean, you can't drive around the perimeter, you can't take off, you can't land. And for very good reason, to secure the important leaders of our nation. But when you're a little tiny fighter that doesn't carry a lot of gas but burns a lot of it quickly, it's a big problem. So we had been working with the Secret Service to try to develop better coordination so that we could facilitate our training as well as meet their security requirements. And as part of developing that relationship, we had brought some of the Secret Service over to our unit and flown them in the backseat of the F-16s to prove to them that we are actually good guys. So we knew who they were and they knew who we were. As a result, it was when the Pentagon was hit that Vice President Cheney said, God, don't we have some fighters at Andrews? Somebody get those guys airborne. And they knew who to call. I mean, as I mentioned, when we had the peace dividend in the 1990s, and we drew down all of our forces, and we drew down our alert forces, and we were no longer sitting alert either, even if the 1st Air Force, if NORAD, if that authority had known that we were at Andrews, I don't even know that they would not have had the legal authority to be able to activate us. It's a really unfortunate lesson that bureaucracy actually matters and organization actually matters, and it has real-world consequences. So fortunately, we finally had the authorization from Vice President Cheney. Get somebody airborne. Sass looks at me. He says, all right, Lucky, you're with me. Raisin, you take Igor. You guys wait till you have missiles on board, okay? I want to make sure you guys have missiles. Lucky, let's go. Sass and I run down the hallway to the life support. And we're putting on G-suit and putting on my vest, throwing on my harness, and making sure I've got my helmet, I've got my DTC, I've got my lineup cards, I've got my vest. And Sass looks at me and he says, I'll take the cockpit. I knew that I would take the tail. I remembered my dad had been involved in a safety investigation analyzing a crash of a 737 out of Colorado Springs, and they had lost their empennage. They had lost the vertical and the horizontal tails, and the airplane just went straight in. There was just nothing left. There was no way they could have pulled out, no way they could have controlled it. And the other thing is that they wouldn't have glided in. There would be no fan pattern of debris. It would just be straight down. So I knew that I would take the tail. We're running out as fast as we can go, as fast as I can go. Sass is outrunning me, and he's a major. He's an old guy. With all my flight gear, kind of nearly doubled my body weight. He runs to the first jet on the line, and I run to the next one. Again, recall that I'm just a brand new lieutenant. I've recently become combat mission ready. I just went to my first red flag. And as every pilot knows, it's when you begin to deviate from your habit patterns that mistakes are made. So I run up to my jet, and I put my gear down, and I shake my crew chief's hand, and I grab the forms. I'm going to look through the 781s. I'm going to do my walk around as fast as I possibly can. And Sass is already in the cockpit, and he looks at me and goes, Lucky, what the hell are you doing? Get in the jet. It wasn't because I was being negligent. It was because I knew that if anything in my life mattered, that was it. And I could not screw it up. You recall that we had sent the 3-ship down to Air Force Dare. While we were working to try to get the authorization to launch, while I was making DTCs and lineup cards, while Raisin was calling down to get missiles built up, our supervisor of flying, Phil Thompson, Dog Thompson had gone to fighter weapons school in the F-4, and he had this big, fluffy Vietnam mustache, and he was just a crusty old fighter pilot, and I loved him. I respected him. He had such good tactical horse sense. Calls down to Air Force Dare and tells the Rangers, send the bullies home. Tell them to buster. Buster means come home as fast as you can without using your afterburner. So those guys are coming back at V-mill as fast as they possibly can. Now, I didn't realize, none of us actually knew just yet, when Dog calls down there, that Bully 2 had run himself out of gas. Not really. He had reached bingo, which meant that he no longer had fuel to play on the ranges, but rather Puck had to come home because he had just enough fuel to come home with the necessary reserve. So Shooter clears Puck off. He says, all right, Eric, you go home, and we'll continue, and we'll finish up the mission. We'll do all our strafing. We'll finish the debrief later. So Puck, Bully 2, he's on his way home. And Dog gets a radio call from Puck. Guard Soft's Bully 2. Bully 2, Guard Soft, go. Soft, they're not, Washington doesn't want to let me in the airspace. All right, Bully 2, you just keep heading on back home. I'll take care of this. Dog puts a phone down, calls up center so he can get Bully 2 back home. In a couple other minutes, Puck calls back and says, Guard Soft, Bully 2. Bully 2, Guard Soft, go. Soft, they're asking me if I've got any missiles or bullets or bombs on board. Don't you worry about that, Bully 2. You just come on home. Center had been asking Eric if he had those weapons on board because they needed to know in case they could somehow find a way to use them. Now, the bullies were still living in that pre-9/11 world, right? We all know there was a pre-9/11 world and a post-9/11 world. And what mattered, what defined that doorway was if you had seen the images. On that day, some of us were still living in a pre-9/11 world because who could have imagined something like that happening? And those of us who had seen it, we were now living in that post-9/11 world. So Puck has no idea what's going on. But he comes back home and he lands. And of course, Dog's called down to the Ranger, and we got Bully 1 and Bully 3 coming back home. So Shooter and Billy are coming back home. It wasn't until several weeks later that I had the opportunity to listen to Puck's tapes. And it still gives me the chills to this day. As Puck's coming in, he's getting ready to land. He's pulling up ATIS, the Aerodrome Terminal Information System. It's a loop, an audio loop, that's transmitted every hour to give pilots the information they need to know in order to be able to land. So it gives you the weather, the barometric pressure, what the cloud ceiling is, what the landing runway is, or there's any other information you need to know to prepare. And it lightens the workloads of the controllers. This is what Puck's ATIS said. This is Andrews Information Bravo. Andrews Air Force Base is closed. Washington-class Bravo airspace is closed. Any aircraft attempting to enter Washington-class Bravo airspace will be shot down. So I'm in my jet, and I now realize that I gotta throw the book out. I don't even bother strapping in. I mean, normally it's about a 20-minute process to strap in, to wake your jet up, to make sure that you've downloaded and checked all of your system, gone through your built-in tests, configured all your navigation, your steer points, get your avionics set up right. If you're doing just a close nearby little dogfighting mission, 10 minutes most. And at that point, we didn't have GPS on the aircraft. We had actually just upgraded to the really sophisticated ring laser gyro INS system. It only took 8 minutes, not 16 minutes, to erect. So we were pretty high speed. But we didn't have 20 minutes, and we didn't have 10, and we didn't have 8. We needed to go. I don't bother strapping in. The mantra, the rhythm, the dance of the challenge and response that you do with your crew chief, it's out the window. I'm relying on my knowledge just simply to know the things that I need to do. Master battery on, JAFA start 2, 20% over the hump to idle. And I'm watching my RPM, my temperature, 40%, less than 750, I'm good. And I'm yelling at my crew chief, pull the chocks, pull the chocks. I don't have a radar. There's no data link in the aircraft. All I have right now is my engine, and I'm waking up the rest of the airplane as I can. And I'm getting ready to jump the chocks with afterburner. They pull the chocks. And I'm taxiing after SAS. And my crew chief is still plugged in, and he's running underneath me. And other crew chiefs are running underneath me, pulling the pins out of my TERS. They're pulling the pins out of my external fuel tanks. They're pulling the pins out of my gear and out of my chaff and flare. As we're taxiing on my tapes, I call 2's up, and you can hear Billy Hutchison taking off. Shooter and Billy, Bully 1 and Bully 2, had landed, and Dog says, we'd finally gotten the authorization. Dog checks how much fuel they have. And Shooter doesn't have enough, but Billy's got like 1,200 pounds. And Dog says, okay, they think there's another one coming down the river. You got just enough fuel for one pass up and down the river. So Billy takes off. He's the first one airborne. And he takes off, he stays low, he goes northwest over the Pentagon, up to Great Falls, turns around, down the Potomac, down to where the Potomac turns, hooks 90 left into the bay, and then he comes back home and he lands. And Sass and I take off seconds after him. And we take off and we head northeast into a serene and peaceful and silent sky. There's no one airborne. We head out to the northwest and we never find anything. Sass and I were not heroes that day. The passengers on Flight 93 were the heroes. So you can see why I believe that what I was willing to do that day was nothing special. Because anyone would have been willing to do what I was willing to do and what they actually did. They were average, everyday Americans who realized that there were things in this world that are more important than themselves. And although they might not have raised their hand and taken an oath to give their life in our nation's defense, they did. So they were the true heroes. The DC Guard commanded the Combat Air Patrol for 2 weeks after 9/11, which was unprecedented. Clearly, an event like this unprecedented, but for the National Guard to own the authorization of that Combat Air Patrol was truly unique and different. And we did it because there was a lot of untangling to do after that day. As you can imagine, trying to go through what went wrong and then figure out the appropriate lines of authority and lines of command. And even something as mundane as how do you schedule and how do we force provide to ensure that we can protect our nation's capital. These were all the problems that we were dealing with over the next few weeks. Not me, I was just a line flyer. I'm getting in my jet and I'm pulling at midnight to 4 a.m. night combat air patrol. Our ops group commander, Jeff Johnson, Tuna, was in the Pentagon doing a lot of that work. And he's wearing his flight suit and he's got his patches on. And if you understand how that works, not only with a flight suit do you know your air crew, but you can decode what the patches mean, right? So Tuna gets stopped in the Pentagon by some guy, says, are you from the DC Guard? And Tuna says, yeah. Let me tell you a story. This is the story that he told Tuna and the story that Tuna told us. When the Pentagon was hit, they, of course, evacuated everyone. People went flowing into South Parking, most likely got in their cars and drove away. People came out the metro entrance. But for the people who had to evacuate through to North Parking were trapped. They're coming out the river entrance, they're coming out to North Parking, they're going over the bridge that goes over 110, and they're getting stuck in that parking lot that's in between Route 110 and the Potomac River. And they can't go anywhere. Because our evacuation procedures were built for primarily fires, not something like this. And the wind was light. It was a perfect flying day. It was light and out of the southwest. So it's blowing the smoke and the ashes and the air up over the center and actually right over North Parking. And there's a child development center, still there, but it's closed now. The women are evacuating the babies out of the child development center. It's like DOD daycare. And again, their procedures are for fire drills. So they're pushing out these cribs with 4 toddlers to 4 babies to a crib and 6 toddlers to a buggy, right? But they can't stay next to the building. They have to get up the stairs and go over the bridge to get to North Parking. But they don't have enough people to do that. I mean, because it wasn't something they were manned for. It shouldn't have been. I mean, it was. So these women are giving babies away. As people are coming out of the Pentagon, they're literally handing babies to strangers. I can't take them all away. Can you please get them to safety? Get them over the bridge. They're giving babies away. But once they get to North Parking, they're trapped. And the ashes are falling on them, and the air is acrid and smoky. And it was, the Pentagon burned for weeks, for months afterwards. And they know something's coming. And if you remember, this was before everyone had a cell phone in their pocket, right? I mean, if you're really somebody, you might have a pager. They know there's something else coming. But they don't know what, they don't know when, and now they're no longer at their desks. They can't get that information refresh. So they're just simply waiting, and they're trapped. And then Billy Hutchison goes zooming right over those guys in full afterburner. And out of silence, they erupt into cheers because they know that we are now airborne, that American Air Force fighter jets are airborne, and we aren't going to let anyone hurt them, that they're going to be okay. I think back now, with years between me and that day, and again, I was there just simply because I showed up for work. And anyone would have been willing to do what I was willing to do. And I know that because, again, not only because the passengers on Flight 93 proved it, but when you look at what everyone up in New York did, the heroism of the first responders running towards the towers, not away. The individuals who were in the towers who helped each other get out, saved each other's lives. And then think of this, the people who cleaned up the towers, going to work every day, knowing that they would die from what they were doing. And they did it every day, and anyways. So when I look back on that day, with the years to be able to reflect on what it might mean, Strange to say this, but I actually have hope. Because we showed who we are as Americans. That we are not a fearful people, that we are not a weak people, that we do not shy from hardship, and that we know that there are things in this world that are more important than ourselves, that are more important than our own personal safety. And that risk is worth taking. It's worth taking for this thing that is us collectively, all of us together, America. Our Constitution, baseball, mom, apple pie, freedom, our way of life. These are things that matter, the things that bring us together. So when I think back, as hard as that day has been for our nation, it gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We do all have stories as to where we were and how that day impacted us. And as I segue into the next part of our program and make our next introduction, allow me a moment to sort of share context that might help with the introduction. On 9/11, I was the airport manager at Reagan National. And so I saw it from the ground, like most of us. And I don't want to take your time now because actually if I do my job well, I'm going to save enough time for questions from you all later. But I think, as you know, we were closed at National not for 3 days, but we remained closed following after all the other airports reopened. And it was rather disconcerting. And we didn't know whether to mothball the airport, to put it on life support, to close it. You may recall from my opening remarks, we opened the Hazy in 2003. Well, there were people that suggested to me in 2001, why don't we turn the terminal at Reagan into an annex for the Hazy? Frankly, most people did not think that National was going to reopen. Vice President Cheney and the Secret Service were dead set against it. And it was interesting because they would say, we can't have aircraft close to the airport. And yet, when the system reopened, in the course of a day, 18,000 aircraft were within 30 minutes time of flight of Reagan National. So there were some things put in place afterwards that, in retrospect, you kind of wonder, did it make much sense? But many of us worked very hard to go ahead to take the actions necessary to reopen Reagan. And from my perspective, from a background in Navy flying and carrier flying, it was startling to me that there was this idea that somehow the nation's capital couldn't be sufficiently protected in a way that would allow aviation to proceed. Because on aircraft carriers, we sailed into harm's way all the time. But we had very distinct procedures that you had to follow to get back on that ship when we were 100 miles off of Lebanon when the barracks blew out. I can assure you, in an F-14 coming back to the ship, if we didn't follow very prescribed flight procedures, squawk and so forth, we were going to get shot down. And so I had the occasion to meet with Secretary Norm Mineta, one of this country's great Americans, who arguably was the one who shut down the airspace on that day. And as a side note, what air traffic did that day is heroic and a story in itself. But he took it down. But I remember going to his office with my colleagues at the time and showing them a picture of an aircraft carrier. And I said, think of National as an aircraft carrier. What we need to do is devise procedures, profiles, squawk, check-in, two-way communications, all the various things that we would do on a ship. And you do that, and you can get airplanes in and out of here. And oh, by the way, you may not know, but there were IHawk missile batteries set up in Anacostia. You could see them from the airport. So if somebody didn't follow those procedures, there was a rule of engagement to shoot them down. So I don't know if that suggestion carried the day, but I do know that what came out of it was this idea that, yes, you can, in fact, fly into a high-threat area and do so safely and successfully if you have the proper prescribed procedures. Now, the idea that you had to stay seated for 30 minutes before flight, that kind of went away for obvious reasons. But at the end of the day, 3.5 weeks later, the president made the decision to reopen. And I recall going back over to Secretary Minetta's office. It was, I think, a Tuesday, and he said, and I went into his foyer, and who was in there smoking a cigarette? Herb Kelleher and Don Carty and a bunch of the CEOs were sitting there. And I'm looking at Herb thinking, I don't think you can do that here. But Secretary Minetta had summoned the CEOs, and those that couldn't make it were on a telephone and said, President wants to reopen National. Can you do it in 48 hours? Now, I'm sitting there thinking, every cab driver, restaurant operator, rental car worker, they've gone. And so I'm thinking this is sort of like starting the jet. It normally takes time to sort of get back into the game. And without skipping a beat, every CEO said to the secretary, yes, sir, we'll be up and ready. And I'm just looking around going, you don't even know where your people are. But the reality is we did reopen, but it was, as you may remember, very limited, 10 flights a day. And we eventually joined the rest of the aviation system and reopened. And sometimes it's the day after, what happened after 9/11, that is as informative and impressive in my mind as many of the actions that people took on that day itself. But among the commercial airline pilots who boldly returned to their cockpits and helped restore our nation's most critical transportation infrastructure is Heather's father, John. Born and raised in California, John was appointed to the Air Force Academy, where he was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1970. During his academy years, he built model airplanes, flew sailplanes, and earned a degree in aeronautical engineering. He finished pilot training at Vance Air Force Base in 1971 and went on to fly 140 combat missions in the A-7 in Vietnam. After the war, he served as an A-7 instructor and had a tour as a forward air controller. He left the Air Force in 1979, and after his first brief stint with the Airlines, with United, John landed a job with Learfan Corporation at Reno Stead Airport, where he worked for the next 5.5 years as an engineer and test pilot. During his tenure in Reno, John became associated with and joined the Rare Bear air racing team and flew in his first national championship air race in September 1985. While living in Reno, John kept his hand in military aviation by joining the Nevada Air National Guard, flying the F-4 Phantom. He also started his own business, MiG Masters, flight testing and instructing in numerous types of U.S. and foreign aircraft, pardon me, including the MiG-15, MiG-17, MiG-21, and others. His perspective as an accomplished aviator and commercial pilot with United, the job that he then rejoined after the furlough, on 9/11, and as the father of a daughter tasked with defending our skies that day, is truly unique. We'll hear from both of them now, and I invite Heather and John back to the podium. Or chairs.
Thank you, Chris. It's an honor to be here this evening to talk to all you folks and share with you some perspectives. As a father of a fighter pilot, as an airline pilot, now retired from United Airlines. And I'd like to thank Lisa and the GE Corporation and Todd and Bill who are here sponsoring this event. And it's an honor to be here and speak to you folks. I'd like to share with you a few things, events that happened on that day of 9/11, and some perspectives that we gained from those events that day, and things that happened that affected us as a family, as all airline pilots united, and all Americans. The morning of 9/11. Actually, my wife and I were starting the first of 30 days of vacation that I had stored up for a couple of years. The activities that morning were pretty much normal morning activities, getting breakfast and making coffee, until my younger brother Eric called up on the phone and says, "Is your TV on?" I said, "No." He said, "Turn on the TV." So we turn on the TV and it's everywhere. At that time, both of the towers had been hit, and it was obvious that the United States was under attack at that point. My wife, Stephanie, was very distraught at that time, and I did everything I could to reassure her. I said, "Heather's okay. She's airborne." Of course, little did I know what was going on, but it seemed to calm some of her fears. Pardon me. So we got on the phone and tried to call Heather immediately, and of course, as I'm sure all of you know, the telephone lines were just jammed. There's no way to get through. So my wife Stephanie, she gets on the computer and emails to Heather, what's going on. After Heather's first mission, when she got on the ground, she emailed back and said, "I'm okay." Said, "I've been flying, I'm busy," and that was about it, and I'll call you tonight. Or I'll call later. Sometime soon thereafter, Heather's twin sister, Jill, called us up and said, "I need to talk to my sister. I need to talk to her now. The phone lines are jammed." So she couldn't get through, and we couldn't get through. Heather did call that evening, and she said, "I'm at home. I've flown twice. I'm really, really tired. I'm going to bed, and I'll talk to you again sometime." We didn't know the full story yet of what had happened with her mission, that first mission that she described when they were sent out, and they were trying to search out the location of United Flight 93. That day, and for several days thereafter, at our house there in Evergreen, Colorado, the only noise we heard in the skies above were the F-16s that were patrolling from the Air National Guard base at Buckley Air Force Base in Denver. And boy, some of them came over low, and some of them were an afterburner. And folks, that's jet noise, and that's the sound of freedom. We found out also that day that Captain Jason Dahl was a captain of United Flight 93. A friend of ours, his wife, called and told us about what had happened with Jason's airplane. And as you all know, that airplane crashed in Pennsylvania. Now, there's a three-way link between Heather, Jason Dahl, and myself. As I said, Jason was the captain of United Flight 93. And United Flight 93 was the aircraft that Heather and Lieutenant Colonel Sassville were searching for after they launched out of Andrews Air Force Base. Unbeknownst to them, unbeknownst to ATC, Flight 93 had already crashed even as they were getting airborne. So that's why they never found it. The airplane crashed there in Shanksville. Now, Captain Jason Dahl and I shared an office cubicle at United Airlines Flight Training Center. We were both standards captains. And Jason and I had a couple of desks, and he had a picture of his son, Matt, who I believe at that time he was still in high school, and of his lovely wife, Sandy. And whenever Jason and I had a chance to chat, he would talk and just brag about his son, how smart he was and everything he was doing and all the things they did together and the fun they had, and his love for his wife, Sandy. After the events of 9/11, There was a memorial service in Denver at the church that Jason and Sandy and Matt went to. And there were about 400 United pilots. I think even more than that. We were all in our uniforms. And this was not a mega church they went to, but I guess I don't know if you'd call it an auditorium or a theater. It was as big as what you're sitting in right now. And it was standing room only. And again, all of us were in our uniforms. The eulogy that day was delivered by Matt, Jason's son. He was poised. He was very articulate. It was a beautiful eulogy. There was not a dry eye in the house. To this day, I don't know how he stood there and did that. Pardon me. After the service, Hap, another friend and a United pilot, said, "Hey, John, tomorrow let's put our uniforms on and let's go out to Denver International Airport and go into the terminal and just talk to the passengers." And I said, "Hap, that's a great idea." We did that. We got in there the next day, went out to DIA. We spent several hours out there and went up and down the terminal talking to passengers, trying to reassure them about the security and the safety of traveling on at least the United Airlines or all the airlines. And for some people, it was very emotional. And they were very touched. And for other folks, they were very stoic, and they showed a lot of courage to be, good, loyal Americans and get up in the skies and travel again. So we hope that was a meaningful experience for them, and it certainly was for Hap and myself. I can guarantee you that. There were some anecdotal accounts by other pilots of things that happened on 9/11 and afterwards. After the initial attacks out here at Dulles Airport, ground control in the tower, anybody they could get a hold of who had not gotten airborne yet, they turned them around and sent them back to the gates out at Dulles Airport. And I talked to actually one of the captains, and he said as soon as they parked and shut down and they opened the door, several young males, Middle Eastern in appearance, jumped up and ran forward out the door of the aircraft and disappeared into the crowds into the terminal. It can only be supposed what might have happened had that airplane gotten airborne. You can only theorize about that, but I think you may know, because the 4 airplanes that were used as terror weapons were not the only ones that they had planned for that day. There were other accounts from some flight attendants and some other pilots that I talked to after 9/11, that when they were up in altitude and cruising, that there were incidences once, twice, of, again, young men that probably came from that part of the world would get up and they were moving rapidly up the aisle towards the cockpit area. And then they would stop and turn around and go back and sit in their seats. So again, we can only surmise that perhaps maybe they were trying to probe. Who knows? I don't know what came of any reports of those incidents, and whether people were searched by the FBI or the Secret Service. I had my own personal experience. It was prior to 9/11. We'd heard some reports at United of some airline crews whose uniforms had been stolen. Some of their layover hotel rooms had been broken into, and I think in one encounter, a hotel room, a guy answered the door when somebody knocked on it, and they overpowered him and stole his uniform and ran off. Now, back at that time, prior to 9/11, you might only surmise that perhaps they were just trying to get a free ride in the cockpit as a jump seater, much like, who was that movie? What's the name of the movie, Heather? Catch Me If You Can, yes. I don't know if the movie was made yet, but that was the scenario. Get a uniform and try to get a free ride in the cockpit wherever you want to go. I had a layover, I think you all are obviously local to Washington, D.C. Is it the Courtyard Marriott out at Dulles Airport? Is that the airport that's out right out next to the terminal? I think it is. Anyway, I had a trip. I had a layover at the hotel there right at the airport. And early in the morning, there's a knock on my door. So I get up and I look out, and guess what the gentleman looks like? Was outside that door. And I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "This is engineering, sir. We have a report of a problem with the air conditioning." I said, "Just a minute, and let me put my clothes on." I ran back and got on the phone and called the front desk, and I said, "Have you sent anybody from engineering to come and work on my air conditioning?" I said, "No." I went back to the door, looked out the peephole, and there was nobody there. Foolishly, I opened the door to take another look. He could have been hiding. But then looked up and down the hallway, and the person was gone. So I got dressed, immediately went down to the desk, and I said, "Hey, somebody came and knocked my door, said he was from engineering. I don't know what's going on." Now remember, that was prior to 9/11. It was only a few weeks prior. So that was a dot that could have been connected to some other dots. Some other things were going on regarding some of these people getting training at some flight schools, who said, "I don't want to learn how to land the airplane, only how to fly it." And some of those reports are made to the FBI, and nothing was done. They didn't communicate with the Secret Service or anything. At that time, we didn't have the Department of Homeland Security. So those dots were not being connected. And the dot that I saw that morning, I must admit that I didn't try to get it connected to anything. Now, many of you up in the audience, or some of you up in the audience, almost everybody in this country has a tie to something that happened on that day on 9/11, or somebody, whether they were involved in some activities or they were tragically killed as a result of the terrorist acts. On the court where we live, my wife Stephanie and I live in Evergreen, there are 4 families on that court. 3 out of the 4 families on that court had a tie to something or someone from 9/11. Obviously, my wife Stephanie and I, with our daughter Heather, and the mission that she performed on that day with honor. Right across our court, the gentleman and his wife who moved in there, he had been an executive at a financial services company that had their offices up on one of the upper floors in one of the Twin Towers. And if I recall correctly, I think he told us that they lost about 12, maybe it was 13 friends that morning. Down at the bottom of the court, the couple down there, their son Joe worked for a company that was either at the bottom of one of the Twin Trade Towers or in a building immediately next to it. On 9/10, do you ever hear 9/10? You only hear 9/11. On 9/10, Joe worked very, very late that night and into the next morning. And he decided to sleep in and didn't come into work that morning. Now, whether or not he would have perished or whether he could have been one of the people who escaped, we'll never know. But he on a normal course of events, would have been going to work that morning. I was allotted 10 minutes, Chris. I mean, if I've gone past that, get the hook or hit the gong, and I'll be done, yeah. Okay. There's something I'd like to talk about just briefly here in closing. There have been a lot of media stories that are written about our daughter Heather's activities on the morning of 9/11, launching in her F-16 with SAS and everything that transpired afterwards. And I had been interviewed about that also. They have used some artistic license in trying to say that Heather could have thought that she was maybe taking off and could shot down an airliner that I may have been the captain of. And I had been to the East Coast. Okay, fact. I had, in fact, recently flown some flights from the East Coast. And when I was on a layover here, either when I arrived or when I was getting ready to leave, I'd give Heather a call. Fact. Yeah, as I said, I had called Heather when I was here on those layovers. And another fact, did she know if I was flying that morning? No, she didn't. Fact. Heather, as you've seen from her story, was totally focused on the mission at hand, to perform her duty as an F-16 pilot in a correct manner and be a good wingman for SAS and do whatever was required on that morning to try to protect our country. Now, the supposition by some of these news writers to try to, again, using dramatic license, was to try to make it sound as if when our daughter Heather was running out to the airplane or getting airborne, and when they were airborne, headed on out looking for United Flight 93, and they didn't know it was 93, just somebody was inbound, was that she was thinking, oh my gosh, my dad might be a captain on this airplane, and I might have to bring down an airplane from which my dad is on board. That was not the case at all. She was totally focused on the mission at hand. So there was a lot of artistic license taken by people who have written stories about this, and that gives me some concern. Heather talked about the true heroes on United Flight 93. She has been called a hero by some people who have written, and she is, as you've heard by her self-declaration, she discounts being called a hero on that day. And as she didn't use the terminology, but she's before said that she was an accidental witness to history on 9/11, along with Mark Sassville and so many other people that were involved in protecting our nation and responding. And she said the true heroes in that chapter of what happened on 9/11 regarding Flight 93 were those passengers who prevented the terrorists from turning United Flight 93 into a weapon of terror. And we should all never forget that. They were a small group of heroes that did that, very, very small group, along with all the heroes that responded and did what they did at the Pentagon, in the air over Washington, D.C., and who responded at the Twin Trade Towers, doing what they could to save as many lives as they could. So, again, thank you very much for listening to my drivel, and I guess we're going to start some question and answer here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And, well, I'm kind of going a little bit over. Hopefully I'll keep my job. But I think it's important to provide you all at least a few minutes an opportunity to ask questions, because it is so important not just to tell the story and remember the story, but to get the facts right. And who better to answer to that than John and Heather. Question up here.
Heather, I've got a lot of vivid memories of that morning. One of them was being in my house about 2 miles southwest of Nashville and seeing an F-16 turn onto what would have been final on the unused runway, the northeast southwest runway of Nashville. Low, I think in landing configuration, definitely nose up and quite slow, only a couple 100, 200 feet off the ground. Was that you?
I don't think I need to repeat the question. I think probably everybody heard that. No, the question is, the gentleman witnessed or says that there's an aircraft on short final to National and was wondering if it was in fact Heather.
No, although I'd love to put DCA in my logbook, I never got into a situation like that. During the course of that day, we did a number of intercepts on small aircraft, which if you're flying a Cessna and you're flying an F-16, they go very different speeds. So one of the more convenient ways to slow down to get to a closer speed that's more Cessna-like is to throw your gear down, because that automatically deploys the flaps. We need to have a flap override system in the F-16 to manually deploy the flaps because that's not something we ever normally do. So the only thing that I can speculate is that someone, and I did not do that, I did not make that kind of intercept that day, is that someone later that day who took off might have been trying to intercept a small aircraft and would have put his aircraft into that configuration to achieve that kind of speed. But that wasn't me.
I'm not sure if it syncs up with the timing of what you witnessed, but I do know that when the air traffic system was effectively being shut down, we did have arrivals into Reagan coming in, and it was at that point determined better to get them on ground, even if it's Reagan or National at the time, rather than somewhere else. So I do know that in the midst of everything happening, we were getting some final arrivals into National. Don't know if that was it. I know, in fact, watching 757 come in and having that same thought. Question over here, sir.
You talk about specifically your mission prior to 9/11. You said you'd be looking for bearers or something coming over. But if you were on hot standby prior to the 90s, or if someone was on hot standby as a procedure, what would that have gained for your mission after 2001?
So
Heather, do you want to repeat the question, I think, for the
I will a little
okay.
bit. The question is really about, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're interested in, of those units that were still sitting alert, what was their response?
If you were on alert,
And so if we'd had alert at DC, what would that have been like? So the aircraft that were sitting alert, they had pre-planned flight profiles where when they were scrambled, they would jump in their aircraft and they would actually take off over the Atlantic. So that's why you have the aircraft that were detached to Langley actually taking off and flying east over the Atlantic, and why you have the aircraft that were sitting alert at Otis flying over the Atlantic before they're turned around to respond to the threat that was actually internal. So had Andrews been sitting alert, would that have solved the problem? I cannot speculate in an educated manner because there are a number of things that would need to have happened within the, not just what would their profile have looked like, how long would it have taken them to turn around, what's the chain of command, et cetera, and what would have triggered that kind of response. So unfortunately, I don't think it's fair to woulda, coulda, shoulda the situation. It just is.
Gentleman in the red shirt.
Yes. I was one of those rescue workers working that day. And
Thank you.
no, I want to thank you because they pulled us away from doing what we was trained to do for years at that moment. Until those fighters showed up. We were cheering, and you're absolutely correct. We were cheering for y'all, and we was thanking y'all for showing up to save us, to look out for us. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you.
Right here, sir.
So, Heather, you said that you didn't have missiles, but did you have any weapons charged, any working weapons on your F-16?
So we routinely carry
the-
105
If you could repeat the question, sorry, because I know there's some corners here that didn't get the question.
the question was, we didn't have missiles, but did we have any kind of weapon loadout? And we routinely flew with 105 rounds of bullets in the nose, partly for a weight and balance issue. But those bullets were kinetic bullets. They were lead nose. They were just, lead balls. When we go to combat, we fly with high explosive incendiary rounds and 510 of them. The cannon in the F-16 fires its rounds at 6,000 rounds a minute. So 510 rounds is a little over 5 seconds of gun, and 100 rounds is 1 second of gun. We knew taking off that between the two of us, even with perfect aim, that 200 rounds would be utterly insufficient to take down the airliner.
In the back, sir.
After Skatana was declared and the civil aircraft were coming down, and as the day progressed, who had authority or took authority to authorize shooting shoot down civil aircraft after that? Was it NORAD or did it come from the White House?
We were provided, the question is, after all the civil aircraft were grounded, who had the command and control, who had the authority to declare an aircraft hostile so that we could take it down? Typically within combat operations, the rules of engagement, the ROE, have a very specific matrix that you have to fulfill in order to be able to shoot somebody down. We need to know what the aircraft is, we need to know where it originated from, we need to know what does it have hostile intent, things like that. The ROE that we had that was actually provided later during that sortie, we were provided free fire, which meant that as an individual fighter pilot sitting in my F-16, I could, Heather Penney, make the decision to shoot down an aircraft. I didn't need to ask Mother, may I? There was no going up the chain of command, which, I mean, two things. The level of risk that was assumed by enabling us to make that decision was necessary because of the confusion and the chaos that was going on within all of the military elements. Because as you mentioned, there was no clear chain of command. There was nothing set up to be able to support that kind of ROE. My other observation of that free fire authorization is that nobody used it. So within the chaos, the fog of war, the confusion, and as you can also imagine, the anger, all of those emotions that every American was feeling that morning, it was overcome by the professionalism and the discipline of every fighter pilot who was airborne that morning, that they chose not to use it. Because the skies were still full of airplanes. There were people that had, that was a time when you didn't have to file before you flew. You didn't have to file a flight plan. You didn't have to talk on the radio. So if you didn't listen to the radio, if you didn't listen to your favorite WTOP or, watch the news that morning, you just got up and, went out to your little airplane and waxed on her a little bit and poured in some oil and took off. You had no idea that we had just suddenly shut down the entire national airspace. So I think it is also truly a testament to the professionalism of all of us who were airborne that day that we did not actually get trigger happy. I thumped a ton of little airplanes that day, and I have a lot of guilt for what I must have done to their poor little wings. Owning little airplanes myself must have scared the heck out of them, but we did, and we kept everyone safe. And here's the other thing I actually want to bring up, and Chris is a little bit kind of tied to your story, is how underappreciated Potomac TRACON is in our response to 9/11. I would love to kiss those controllers because their mental agility in transitioning from keeping aircraft separated and sequencing them for the most efficient and effective operations to get them on final and landed and taken off and all. Now, I've cursed them as many times too because I'm sitting there, trying to take off and I can't get my IFR clearance. But they were so competent when SAS says, okay, hey, Potomac, I know you guys, do you have any military background? No? Okay, all right, so let's just call the national VORTAC, let's call that bullseye, okay? Can you do that? Okay, now you got do you have that on your scope? Okay, awesome. You got the radials coming off of there. All right, so you got the radials and you've got the range rings. Okay, so if you see a contact, if you get a radar contact that's due east and, it's 30 miles away, here's what I want you to say. Contact bullseye 090 for 30. And if you can get an altitude cut, give me the altitude as well. And like that, the controllers swapped their mental approach, they swapped their paradigms. They adopted our fighter pilot language, and they helped facilitate our ability to clear the airspace. And then as the airspace got super congested with all of the responders, the helicopters, the medevacs, the Army flights, not only did they call out the unknowns, the bogeys, but then they also called out the aircraft that we knew were friendlies. And they would say, hey, that's medevac flight 90, whatever. This is their bullseye cut. They're going, this is their destination. This is their hospital. So we didn't have to waste our time on friendlies that were helping take care of people, helping respond. And we could focus really on those unknowns, on those bogeys, and keep everyone safe. So I really just think that Potomac, they're unsung heroes here.
Absolutely. I know we are going a little bit over, but we'll take one more question. If there's another question in the audience. In the way back.
Yeah, Heather used to fly out of my airport, Lee Airport near Annapolis.
Hi, Michelle.
We were near the arrival to BWI. After 9/11, it was just so eerily quiet. I know you don't call yourself a hero. The only thing we heard were the F-16s. It was an extreme comfort when I knew it was you. Thank you.
On that note, a fitting note, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank all of you for taking time this evening to listen to this story. As mentioned, it's an important story. It's a story to be remembered, and it's a story to be told and retold. We were very fortunate to have John and Penney join us tonight. Again, thank you for taking time, both of you, and for what you've done for aviation in this country. I would appreciate that we will not be able to provide autographs tonight. I know that that's sometimes something we do, but given the hour, we will not be able to do that. Again, Lisa, to GE and your entire team, I want to thank you for sponsoring this event, the past events and the future events. Thank you so much. And I guess I would just close by saying, I hope in a few days' time, on the 11th of September, each of you will, in your own way, remember that day, what it meant to this nation and to what it meant to us individually and collectively, and take a moment to thank those people that sacrificed so much that day and that live on in our memories. Thank you and have a great evening.